I think we learn more about ourselves through what we would stow away for than what we choose to do in the main parts of our lives. What is that thing where you wanted to do it so badly that you hid in a steamer trunk or whatever it was in order to get to be a part of that experience that you obviously were not invited to or allowed to go to? Has either of you ever stowed away?
I have. What about you, ma'am?
I have been the unwitting driver of a stowaway.
I
Amazing.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, my unwitting driver was my dad, and I really wanted to go to work with him. And so I hid behind the front seat of the car when he was driving to work. He was a professor at Whitworth College in Spokane, Washington, where I grew up. And I popped out when he pulled into the parking space at work. I think I nearly gave him a heart attack. But then he let me go to work with him that day. And I went to classes and I sat through college classes. He taught like a core, sort of humanities, civics class, other history classes. There was only one small problem with that, which is he forgot to call my mom and tell her that I was with him. I have never seen her more mad when we got home because she literally thought it was like calling the police thinking I'd been kidnapped.
That's amazing.
This is exactly what I would do. So I have to say, it is way...
funny. I have never encountered, there's certainly days, but I love working and I always have loved working, and I've always found workplaces fascinating, and I've always liked creating teams that get things done. And I just think I found it fascinating from a really young age, weirdly.
That's amazing.
So, I came by it honestly when I stowed away to go to work.
I love it. I love it.
What we stow away for.
Where are you driving away?
There's a whole business book in this. What we stow away for is what we truly love. It's one of these psychometric discovery books. But all jokes aside, I think we're on to something. I think if it's good enough that you're willing to transgress and hide to have the experience, then it's the kind of experience you should have. And I really want to ask you, Susan, just before we lose this, you said this great thing about loving working. Is the work you love, are they generally things that you have to kind of like sneak your way into? You have to break some rule to do? Tell us what drawing on that early story and you getting to actually spend that day with your father, what do you love in work? What gives you that flow?
So, I've been attracted my whole career towards solving problems that make a difference in people's lives in some large way. And when I am doing work where I don't feel like it's having an impact, that's when I tend to get a little frustrated. And I remember I had a job in retail selling really bad clothing to people. I had quota. I didn't last very long.
Everything sounds awful about that.
But then I switched. I worked in a mall, like every teenager. And but I switched to a gift store that sold locally crafted. It was called Made in Washington, and it was a store that helped local producers who had generally, made their products find a market and sell. And I got to meet the people who made the things because they would bring the inventory in personally often. And it just felt so much better. And I felt like these were high quality items. And so I think even as a teenager, I was sort of drawn to, there's a way to, you could do the same thing and you can do it in a way that's soul sucking, or you could do it in a way that can make a difference in this world. And I've just always gone towards the make a difference. Now, what's interesting is that I did a very short stint in government, and I did very short stints sort of in nonprofits. And one of the other things that has been a pattern is I really firmly believe that there is a way for business to drive impact. And that when businesses are run with this idea of the triple bottom line, or, people, planet, profit, really magical things can happen because businesses have a leverage and a scale and an intensity and a focus and a speed that you don't always get in other environments. And so if you mix those two things, which is impact and business, we can solve everything. The one thing I would just say that I think is really, really challenging about the incentives of business in general, but particularly here in the US, is the short-termism.
Mm-hmm.
Your incentives for executives and your incentives for publicly traded businesses is how you're doing quarter to quarter. Maybe the average tenure of a CEO has gone down to something like 3 years. I could wave a magic wand to drive impact-oriented businesses, it would be to get the short-term thinking out of the incentive compensation systems.
For the publicly traded companies, right?
For publicly traded companies and, to be honest, executive compensation in private companies, private equity-backed companies, because
Yep.
private equity-backed companies are supposed to show a massive return in 3 to 5 years,
Right.
Right.
That leads to very strange behavior. So it's not just public companies, but it's any companies that have owners who are primarily motivated by short-term financial returns.
I'm very excited to have us talking to Susan Hunt Stevens here today. I want to give you a little background on Susan. She's currently on her third startup, and I'm going to talk a little bit about her second startup and her third startup in particular. So her second startup was a company called WeSpire, which was focusing on companies encouraging their employees to, in fact, model and take on ESG aligned behaviors through gamification, through social networking, through content. So really trying to spur employees to do these things to, in effect, earn points in a system that would then give them some rewards. Mm-hmm. But I think it's an amazing, really cool thing that she built. And it was acquired by a portfolio company called Apex Global Impact. Now she's on her third startup, which is a company called Spark Global. And this company is really about inventing solutions, pushing solutions that will help with the climate crisis. And they're focusing very much on the tech space. So digital solutions, software as a service solutions used by people, used by companies. And then there's this sort of second side to the market of the investors and the founders and the executives of how do you think about these solutions in energy, in agriculture, in circularity, in the built environment. And just really impressive stuff around driving this change from multiple angles through multiple different companies and approaches. She's also won EY Entrepreneur of the Year, which is really exciting. She's a Fast Company World Changing Idea honoree, which is great. I mean, she's amazing and wonderful, and we're very excited to have her here. So thank you for joining us.
Well, it's great to be here. Yeah. And it's been fun to, somebody described it the other day as, you're so focused when you're building a startup, and then, which with WeSpire was just an incredible experience. And, but then what Spark Global's been able to do is I've been able to go very wide in climate. And so WeSpire was wide in ESG, but my heart and soul was in the sustainability and climate side of WeSpire. It's where we started, and it's really where my passion is. And so, but I didn't get to work in a lot of the areas of climate through WeSpire. I didn't get to learn about regen ag or circularity or these things. So that over the last couple of years, I've been able to really be able to experience other parts of the climate ecosystem, but all from the perspective of having built and scaled a company in the space, which, is not easy. I mean, it's never easy to build and scale a startup, but it's particularly not easy to build and scale a startup in the climate space. And so to the extent that I can take my lessons learned, in the bumps and bruises and all of that, to help other entrepreneurs be successful in the space. That was the vision. And, obviously, particularly with some of the changes in, in control in Washington, it's a really obviously important time to be helping anybody who's trying to solve problems in the area of sustainability and climate right now. So sort of feel like right time, right place. But the goal or vision is that, this entity helps existing companies scale and scale better, and then creates and launches new companies out of it. And our first one is actually going to be announced in the next couple months.
We're really hoping to go into how you help companies scale in the climate space, those lessons you described learning. We're also going to want to learn a little bit about origin story, how you became you. But maybe before we do all that, we could pick up on a couple of things you said. You used the term short-termism. You talked about soul-sucking work, and then you talked about systems and incentives. And I was hoping, before we let those themes go by the wayside, to connect those ideas a little bit. First of all, the short-termism, I was fascinated by the idea that came up along the way that as a manager, you're almost forced to be short-termism. And both of you used the word invest. And you talked about how even to make an investment. So if you'll allow me, I want to just frame all three, and then I'd be fascinated to see how we connect them, because Mim and I, in our book, talk about how often, as a young person today, you are forced, you essentially have to take on work. Have to is strong, but you are strongly incentivized to use your work to take on work that is soul-sucking, right? It is selling the thing you don't believe in order to have some escapes from the doom loops and the polycrisis, right? You almost have to perpetuate these systems that you know are broken and you know are unresponsive to your needs. So I'm really fascinated as we think about systems and incentives, and when we get into how to scale alternatives, in whether you could connect the short-termism with that idea that you got to take the soul-sucking job.
So I guess I would probably be a little bit controversial and say, you don't have to, everyone needs to be able to put food on their table, a roof over their head, pay their loans if they borrowed money for college, and so you have to get to a place where you have an income that meets the needs that you've set up for yourself. And what the research shows is that once you are making 70,000 US dollars, which is the estimate of what it takes for somebody to cover those, for lack of a better word, basic needs. Anything beyond that does not translate to enhanced happiness. And if you can't get to that, and your only choices, based on your skill sets are roles beneath that, I think that's a different conversation around society and the cost of life and things like that. But once you have some optionality at that income level or above, now the choice is yours, and in terms of how you spend this one precious life you have. And I think, the challenge I sometimes have with my colleagues and friends in the purpose movement is it sort of assume it's almost like it's easy to figure out your purpose. I actually don't think it is. And what I would tell young people is, I said, often you have to figure out what soul-sucking means to you and what fulfilling means to you by trying a bunch of things and figuring out which of those things feels soul-sucking and which of those things feels purpose-driven.
And fulfilling is so much less visceral a word, right, Susan? Yeah. Like, if we can get something as good as soul-sucking for the other thing, we probably figured out what it is.
Yeah, exactly. But
like soul nurturing.
Yeah, well, fulfilling is the word, or fulfilling, meaningful, a place where it really doesn't feel like work. You're actually excited on Monday morning when you wake up to go and spend some time doing it. And I think, and what that is going to be is different for every person. I spent 9 years at the New York Times, but I did because I really believe in the power of and the importance of the fourth estate. And how do we, on the business side, ensure that the work that these people are doing to keep literally society free is funded through this crazy transition? So, for me, that was always the way to think about it. But that isn't the way everybody will think about it. That just worked for me.
When I was in college, I had a career counselor told me I was too quiet to be a management consultant. And I'm like, okay. So I went out and I got a management consultant job, because I was kind of annoyed that she told me that I was too quiet to be a management consultant. And to your point, Susan, I learned great things. I learned the importance of work. I learned the importance of grinding out work when you're miserable and tired and hungry and you haven't slept and you have so much work to do. The importance of putting your head down and grinding out the work. That is an incredible skill set that very few jobs give you. And that skill set got me through graduate school with small children.
Yeah.
Where like I could put my head down and I can grind out the work and I can write a dissertation while teaching 4 classes a semester and raising 2 children. I do not recommend that. But yeah. But I knew how to do it because of this work experience.
Susan, Mim and I talk all about experimentation and the experimental mindset, as we call it. And we usually talk about it in terms of the impact of what you could do, whether people will use it, whether it's viable, et cetera. But what you're making me think is that career plan is just fundamentally the wrong paradigm. And we should be looking at career experimentally. And many parents listening to this, may be afraid that now, their child won't do pre-med or whatever they were planning on. But I think that you've brought up something really interesting, that part of our experimentation is to figure out what finds our flow, and we don't know in advance. You talked about, well, if you have a lot of educational debt, and then you used a phrase, the personal costs, or a related phrase. And it does occur to me that often I remember being in this think tank, and they were saying, don't worry about educational debt. All the evidence says you can pay it off. You get IRB, or income-based repayment. But I remember turning to the researcher next to me and saying, doesn't it make you risk averse? And she's like, yes, I'll send you the gas study. So if we're taking on things that raise our personal overhead too early, are we cutting off our capacity to experiment in this way?
It's a constraint. Is it cutting it off? Not entirely, but I call it the golden handcuffs, and I would tell you, it's not just educational debt. It's working in investment banking and then taking out a mortgage that is appropriate with your investment banking salary. But if you want to go be an entrepreneur, you can't pay your mortgage, because you chose to live at a life. And so, there's decisions you make along the course of life, or you buy that second home, or you do this thing that put you in a place where those financial decisions have and limit your ability to potentially experiment as much as you may feel the desire to. And so I think these are just really real things. And what's interesting is I assume you're familiar with the work that Dave Evans and others did on Design Your Life, which is the whole idea. DYL is, bringing design thinking into life planning, and thinking about it. And, I think the work was originally really thought about for college students and sort of people that were on the cusp of this. But the reality is that now being in my 50s, I get to look back and say, you hit these points all along life. You hit these points when you commit to another person and now have to make joint life decisions around career. When you bring other humans into your life as a parent or as a very, very committed aunt or uncle or something like that, now you're making decisions, taking the effect of those decisions on those humans. Then those humans leave, and now you have a different choice and opportunity. And I haven't hit the grandparent stage, but I know people totally change their lives when all of a sudden there's grandparents involved. And so I guess the fundamental competency, skill, thing that I encourage everyone to learn is just agility. How do you be an agile human? How do you learn how to, really reflect and know yourself well? How do you look at what's happening in the world around you? How do you, broadly and then in your sphere and things like that, and navigate to those things that, to the greatest extent possible, make it so when you wake up in the day and you look in that mirror, that proverbial mirror that Steve Jobs speaks to in his commencement address, and the question he asks is, are there too many days when you look in it, you don't want to go spend it the way you're going to go spend it? And that doesn't mean that every day is great. It's this, when there's too many in a row, you kind of know it.
I wonder as we move this discussion to thinking about being able to scale companies doing sustainability, whether there isn't something in what you've said that about keeping our agility and also keeping our pack light in order to have those options.
We use stuff as a numbing mechanism for potentially being in a soul-sucking job or in a relationship that isn't fulfilling, or in a, that can be that. We use it because we're insecure. We want to keep up with the neighbors or the Joneses, or, things like that, as they like to say. But there's very little research that says what you own makes you happy. So I went back to the sustainable design program at the Boston Architectural College. And one of the books we had to read in my very first course was called House Thinking. And it was a book about how, as homes have gotten bigger and less creative about how space is used, there's actually a very strong correlation with the divorce rate, interestingly enough, tied to home size and home design.
Wow.
Isn't that fascinating? Yeah. And so,
it sort of blows your mind, but it also kind of makes sense.
Yeah, and so how your home is designed can actually have a very big impact on your personal relationships. Isn't that crazy? The reality is that one of the biggest crises right now is a crisis of loneliness and disconnection. We could spend a whole other podcast on social media, and things like that, because it's not good. There's nothing good in the data, with one notable exception. And I don't want to lose sight of this, which is, you can't be it if you can't see it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Is very powerful. And there are boys and girls, and young women and young men who live in small towns, or who live in, smaller countries, who don't have an opportunity to see things.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't see it, you don't know you can be it.
Mm-hmm.
So the one thing I will say positive about social media is, I do think it gives people an ability of, when you are surrounded by not what you want to be necessarily, or you want to see that there is a different way to be, it can give you some ideas.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe, the downside is, we all think we need to be in this, beautiful magnolia home because that's what you see on Instagram. But the reality is, you also get to see, women who are in space, or you also get to see that, a incredibly talented Black woman is the lead dancer for the New York City Ballet, and so I think there's a value in social media of seeing it and helping young people believe it. It's possible. And I think the other part is, particularly if you have a very niche situation where you don't have community around you of people like you may have a rare disease, you may have a differing ability, you may have just a strange interest, relative to your neighbors. To be able to connect globally with other people like you and find that community of support, I think is very valuable as well. And so I see those two things as positive.
One way that I might take away what you said is that it's about a platform for what I can be versus what I can have and show that I have. But then there's another version of what you're saying that is much more, hey, wait a minute. It's even aspirations can become a form of handcuffs. So what I want, if the focus is on that agility and that open horizon that you started the conversation with, then it has to do with what models I'm seeking, and whether I'm seeking models for being able to make my life about the existential project, make my life, sorry to use, fancy de Beauvoir terms, but make my life about what I build and what my instead is, right? If that's what I'm after, that's quite different from making my life a fancy scene from a TV show. And I'm interested how you'd answer that, but I also really want to make sure that we get to talk about, we've talked about personal chance to say what if instead, but also if I want to build a company that can scale sustainability, what gives me the chance to do that?
Yeah. So let's just, I think, acknowledge that to even get to have this conversation, you're already operating from a place of privilege,
Right.
And so, just to state the obvious, if you're worried about a roof over your head, if you have a chronic disease and are fighting for healthcare or any of these things, you don't have the luxury of saying, what if instead? At some level, you're like, how do I put one foot in front of the other and make sure that I can function? But I think once you get past that and you are at a place where you have ground level security, maybe the way you're thinking about it, then you are in a position where you have three things that you're thinking about in general, and that is your time, your talent, and your treasure. Is the three that I frame that. The first thing that I always encourage people to do is to actually spend a week writing that down, actually tracking and seeing where are you investing your time and where is that investment rewarding to you. It's fun, it's happy, it's bringing me money, it's paying the bills, it's doing this thing, where is it? And where is it not? Or where is it maybe even hurting you, kind of thing. Then there is the question of talent, and we all have things where when we do them, it feels easy. And yet if somebody else did them, it would feel hard to them. And then we all have things where if we do them, it feels really hard and somebody else does it really well. You are never, ever, ever going to see me pursuing a PhD in physics. Just not happening,
Famous last words.
There's just no talent there for that. There's a lot of talent, but not for that. And so knowing where your talents, and that's not to say you can't learn new things, but, but I do think people have lanes where the things are easier versus harder.
So can you talk a little bit about the different branches of what Spark Global is trying to do and how you're trying to attack the climate crisis? It seems like, from what I can tell, from multiple different angles, kind of at the same time, and how that all hangs together for you.
Yeah. The best analogy for Spark Global right now is it's essentially family office meets climate innovation studio. There are lots of important problems, but very few have I'm just going to use the word ticking time bomb aspect to them like the climate problem has. And there's a bazillion reasons for why it's been hard to scale climate innovations. I'll say that the 2 to 3 are that first and foremost, it just takes a lot longer because this is a lot of hard science, And so venture models for software kind of came into the space and then realized these things take a lot longer than software. So there's a mismatch on the investment and investor horizons and timeframes for return versus what it takes to do this. And so, people who were in the first wave of venture investing weren't so happy with how the outcomes were because things just took so much longer to scale. The second is there's just a lot of regulation and policy that is causing a lot of friction in scaling and adoption. The third is that we are talking about something so fundamental, if you think about it, which is transitioning from a fossil fuel powered economy on this entire planet to not being in a fossil fuel powered economy on this entire planet. And if you think about the theory of change, that many people believe in, most notably one of my investors, Deb Fries, who did an incredible podcast around this at TEDx Jamaica Plain called The Localist. Old systems, big, complex old systems cannot change, is her theory. They have to die, and a new system has to emerge, and there's this gap. And the gap is messy and painful. And what we are in right now is the gap. We are in the gap between the fossil fuel system dying and the renewable energy system taking over. So I'm just doing everything we can to think about how do we get and launch new innovations in this space. And some of it is by working as an investor at a venture fund. Some of it is, as an EIR at Earthshot VC. and doing that. Some is by sitting on the board or being a strategic advisor to scale ups, people who are trying to get out, get velocity, generally around go to market. So helping, how do we get their innovations adopted by large corporates? How do we get their innovations funded by, large players that can move more quickly? And then the last is, okay, where I see a gap and don't see anybody doing something and it's a really big need, should we start something? And so the two areas that I'm really working in are regenerative ag, and just everything around transitioning to a better way to farm for planetary health, the health and well-being of farmers, et cetera. And then disasters, and just how do we build a better system for responding to natural disasters, particularly helping people rebuild their homes and lives afterwards. Because, regenerative ag is the next big lever after renewable energy for solving the climate crisis, but it's about 10 years behind where renewable energy is. And disasters is an unfortunate consequence of us moving too slow. And so the system we have for that was designed when the storms came every 50 years, 100 years. Now that they're coming 100 a year, the systems designed to handle it are breaking. And so we're working to try to fix it.
Let's focus on timeframes and gaps, both of which you've mentioned. So we've done recent interviews on this podcast with multiple folks in regen ag and in disaster planning and how we handle that. But you talked about a ticking time bomb, and you talked about early stage investor models that are premised on everything works like software. It's a big topic in the book Mim and I are putting out this year. So how do you help the folks in regen ag, help the folks in disaster planning who actually give them 10 years and you'll be ahead of the game, but we have all this time pressure to address the climate crisis faster than that?
Yeah. So in regen ag, there's sort of two systems problems that need solving. And so I'm advising a company that's addressing one of those system problems, and then I'm building a company to address a second system problem. So there's plenty of money globally to support farmers to do things. But right now, that $700 billion a year in agricultural subsidies is going towards the wrong things. So how do you change the subsidies? And how do you then deploy the subsidies towards those things that are going to be regenerative, but paired with the expertise to help farmers adopt new behaviors and practices? And then how do you measure what's working and what's not? Because some of it's new. Does this biologic work or not? Does this biochar have the impact we think it's going to have, and all of that. So if you can put all of those three things together, and CIBO Technologies is a company that's doing that, where it's taking the incentives, getting it with matching it with the expertise, getting it to farmers, and then measuring whether it's working or not. So if you can scale that globally.
Wait, can you zero in just for a second before you go on, Susan, on that incentive picture? Yeah. When my own students at the Bard MBA in Sustainability have tried to do biochar, they've run into a wall. They've said it's going to take a little longer and the regulatory incentives aren't here yet, right? How, in the example you're giving, are we dealing with those two time skews?
Yeah, so first is the USDA solved that one of the problems for us, and they put a $200 incentive out for biochar application. Mm-hmm. So that got solved at the federal level, at least here in the US. And the second is that the X Prize put a $50 million bounty out there to encourage innovation. They just awarded the prize, which did not go to a biochar team, but the runners up were a biochar, was a biochar company, but it catalyzed a ton of innovation in biochar. What this did is it basically is taking the companies who sell biochar, giving them a market, taking the incentives for doing biochar and getting it through the system, taking experts and matching them to the farmers so when they apply it, and then measuring whether or not what impact biochar is having. So putting all those pieces together, we're in what I call the intermediate stage, or the innovation stage, is done. The tests have been run. The incentive is structured. Now you have to scale. So the next thing in scaling is, does this have the impact? And if it does, then it's about, okay, how do we take it even to the next level globally? So, we're in that mid stage on that one. So that's just an example. But, one of the companies that a friend of mine is running has figured out the delivery mechanism for vaccinating trees against certain diseases. That's amazing if you think about it. And if you think about that platform of, if we've figured out how to vaccinate trees, what can we solve? And so one of the first things her company is putting the application towards is citrus greening, which could eliminate pesticides because its use, it eliminates burning down the orchard. It would be amazing if it worked. But that's a platform for now. What else can we do that starts to reduce the pesticide load and all of that? So these are the kinds of innovations that have to get to a certain place. And then once you've proven they've worked, then you can start to scale it. But often in that stage before scale, you have to provide enough incentive to reduce risk for anyone who's going to try this new thing. And I think those are just two examples of amazing potential innovations, but we're still in the, how do we prove it works? How do we reduce the risk of transition? And then how do we scale once those things happen?
So one thing I wanted to pick up on what you were saying is, as I'm hearing you talk about these three things you're trying to bring together, we normally think of a lot of these digital innovations as having a two-sided market, but you're making it out like it's really a three-sided market.
It is.
So that extra level of complexity, it's a huge opportunity, but it seems extra challenging to navigate, especially when you have overlapping state and federal regulations, when you have lobbyists operating at different levels.
Oh, yeah.
So which of the three is the part where you're focusing the hardest to kind of say, if we can break this part open, we have a chance to really move things?
I think each of the different factions, first you have to work on all three simultaneously. If you only work on one and not the other two, nothing, the system doesn't change. And all of them are hard.
Yeah. Oh no. Yes. Yes. Of course.
And so there's not one where I could say, if you fix that, this is going to all that. Where I tend to focus is stepping back and trying to make sure that we're really thinking through. I always ask the question: if every farm is a regenerative farm, who wins and who loses? Because if you think about that, then you understand where the biggest friction is going to come from. All electricity is renewable energy of some sort, who wins and who loses. Mm-hmm. And then when you do that, you can start to figure out why it's hard. There's always been a lot of innovation within boundaries, and then the innovation spreads outside of the boundaries. And this is one where, we really do have the opportunity for global collaboration to accelerate it. And we just happen to be living through a little bit of one of the 198 countries deciding to be a royal pain in the butt on this topic. And
which country shall remain nameless? Yes.
Which country shall remain nameless? And I look at it as an entrepreneur and I just say, well, I guess this means another country has the opportunity to win.
Oh.
This is just right. This is going to happen. This transition is not a if, it's a when.
Yeah, there's too much money to be made for it not to happen.
It's also better.
Yeah.
Burning dinosaurs to move around is a bad idea. We should just stop doing it. It's not needed. It's just an old way of doing things.
We're forcing it to continue.
It's got tons of negative externalities, and there's a better way. Yeah. It's a complex process to get to that better way. It hits all of us and everything in our whole entire system. But whoever figures out and leans in most to that is going to be the country that leads in the future. And right now, that's not us. And that's what makes me mad about it.
I agree with everything Susan said. And I guess I would add one wrinkle, which is it's not, the winning can be thought of really in two parts. One is the countries that develop the innovations, and two is the countries that adopt the innovations quickly and integrate them into the society. And I feel like
they're going to be more competitive.
Yep.
They're going to be better places to live.
Yep.
They're going to be healthier.
Right.
They're going to be, and so I think the thing that gets me so frustrated right now is much more about, I'm feeling like we are, I'm a big Go United States, rah cheerleader on innovation. We are the innovation capital of the world historically, and we are choosing to go out on the sidelines in the fourth quarter of the most important game we've ever played. And we're doing it because the people in power on the old system are so scared of losing that that they're literally playing for their lives, and so they're playing very they're going all in to keep the old system as long as possible, and they're incented to do it. But the other part that we also have to be very, very mindful about is I think we have been very bad at hospice care when old systems die previously. And when you don't take care of people while something is changing dramatically around them, guess what? They get pissed.
Right.
And then are like, I don't want this new thing because you just destroyed my life. You just made it so I can't have the middle, can't have the roof over my head, can't have the job I want to have. I'm addicted to things. I'm all of this because you ruined manufacturing in the Midwest, and so if in this transition, which is going to happen, just a matter of when, and how much damage gets inflicted before, if we don't take care of the people whose lives are upended by the transition, I think of the guys that run the gas stations on the corners in our towns. And I think of, the people who deliver oil to our homes. And I think if we don't take care of these people, that's going to be another group who doesn't want this transition for obvious reasons. And so that's we have to practice hospice care in these systems changes. And I think that has to become more of, if I have one major critique of many entrepreneurs who blow up systems, and upend industries and celebrate disruption and all of this. Great. Well, you just destroyed a bunch of people's lives. What accountability, if any, do you have for the fact that you just put every cab driver out of business?
Right.
What accountability do you have for the fact that you have a bunch of teenage girls who want to commit suicide right now because of your invention? And AI, we could have a whole other podcast on that one and the implications of that. And I think entrepreneurs need to take more accountability for the second order effects of their innovations. And I think societies need to take more accountability for the second order effects of these system changes. Because when we don't, bad things happen.
Susan, I think you've given us a striking call to action. And us, I mean, everyone listening to this or watching it. And I'm going to try to state it, and please improve on this. It's going to happen. The fossil age is over already. But there will be an incredible undertow that we're in right now. And if we want to get through that undertow, what can you do? Firstly, to create those bounties, if you're someone with resources, to make sure that you are rewarding the innovator, getting them over that gap, and competing with the massive subsidies keeping the old way in place long after it's inferior. 2, what are you doing to help take care of those who will be hurt, certainly in the near term, because their livelihoods and their lives have been based on the old way of doing things? And then 3, how can you help us see what Susan has stated, that we're already there? It's better, and there's money to be made. So the folks that are going to win the future, how can you help them see that future has arrived, and those who get in will be the ones, countries, companies, investors, who lead that future and benefit from it? Susan Hunt Stevens, what an extraordinary pleasure to have you here on What If Instead. Thank you for making us think.
It's great to be here. Thank you both.